It was a cool evening in the heart of the city, and a large crowd gathered outside a luxurious hotel where a charity gala was taking place. Inside, the room was filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and the hum of important conversations. Among the guests was one of the most successful and well-known figures in the country, Marcus Bennett, a billionaire businessman. He had built his wealth from the ground up. And tonight, he was attending the event to make a generous donation to a cause he cared about. Marcus had always been a humble man, despite his wealth. He didn't show off or flaunt his riches. In fact, he preferred to keep a low profile at events like these, always blending into the background, doing what he could for the causes he believed in. As the evening wore on, Marcus quietly made his way toward the exit, his mind already on the important meeting he had scheduled later that night. He was exhausted, but there was no time to waste. He stepped out into the crisp evening air and walked towards his black luxury sedan, his personal driver waiting by the door. The streets were relatively calm, and the soft glow of the streetlights illuminated the road. Just as Marcus reached his car, he heard the sharp sound of footsteps approaching behind him. Turning around, he saw a police officer walking towards him, a serious look on his face. "Sir, I need you to step aside for a moment," the officer said, his voice stern. Marcus raised an eyebrow, surprised by the sudden request. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, trying to remain calm and composed. The officer's eyes locked onto his, and without offering an explanation, he repeated, "Please step aside." "Do I need to show you my ID?" Marcus asked, reaching into his coat pocket, now starting to feel a bit uneasy. He had dealt with the occasional traffic stop before, but this felt different. The officer didn't respond. Instead, he stepped closer, his hand resting on his belt, as though preparing to take further action. Marcus could feel the tension building in the air. He tried to reason with the officer, asking again what this was all about, but the officer simply muttered something under his breath that Marcus couldn't quite catch. Then, without warning, the officer moved to the side of Marcus and placed his hand on his arm. "You're being detained, sir," he said flatly. Marcus blinked in confusion. "What for?" he demanded. The officer hesitated for a moment before answering. "You fit the description of a suspect we've been looking for. I need to check your identity." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. He knew something wasn't right. He hadn't done anything wrong, but the officer's actions felt off. The situation seemed completely unnecessary. In fact, the officer's tone was harsh, and there was no clear reason for him to be stopped, let alone detained. As the officer began to take out his handcuffs, Marcus quickly glanced around, hoping to find someone who could explain what was happening. But the street was quiet, and the few passers-by simply watched, unaware of the growing tension between the two men. "Sir, I am not a criminal," Marcus said, his voice growing more firm. "I am Marcus Bennett. I own the company you probably have heard of." He could feel his heart racing, not because he feared the officer, but because he knew the situation could quickly spiral out of control. What was happening here? Why was he being treated like this? The officer, still unfazed, only responded with, "We'll sort this out at the station." He moved to grab Marcus's wrist and start the process of arresting him. Marcus stood still shocked, but trying to hold on to his calm. This was not the way he expected his night to go. Marcus stood frozen, his mind racing. He had never expected anything like this. It wasn't just the sudden arrest. It was the complete lack of explanation from the officer. The officer's face was unreadable as he moved to secure the handcuffs, and Marcus felt a chill run through him. What was happening? Why was he being treated like a criminal? "Sir, I really don't think this is necessary," Marcus said, trying his best to stay calm. He could feel the weight of the handcuffs around his wrists, the cold metal pressing against his skin. The officer didn't respond. He simply took out his radio and called for backup, giving the impression that Marcus had done something wrong. It didn't make any sense. Marcus looked around the quiet street, hoping to see someone who could intervene. But the few pedestrians walking by seemed unaware of what was going on. They glanced in his direction, but quickly moved on, as if they didn't want to get involved. "Can I at least know why you're detaining me?" Marcus asked again, his voice firm but controlled. He didn't want to escalate things, but he had the right to know why he was being arrested. This wasn't just a routine stop. It was something far more serious. The officer looked at him, his eyes hard. "You matched the description of someone we're looking for. Now please cooperate," he said, his tone cold. Marcus frowned. This made no sense. He had nothing to do with any crime, and there was no reason for him to be involved in anything suspicious. "Do you know who I am?" Marcus asked, trying to maintain his composure. "I'm Marcus Bennett, the CEO of Bennett Enterprises. I'm a business owner in this city. I've never been involved in anything illegal." The officer didn't seem to care about Marcus's words. He simply motioned for him to move toward the police car, still holding onto his arm tightly. Marcus felt his frustration building, but he remained quiet, trying to think clearly. He could feel his heart beat faster as they walked towards the police car. This was the moment when he knew things could get much worse if he didn't stay calm. As they reached the car, Marcus tried one more time. "I need to make a phone call," he said. "I have the right to contact my lawyer." The officer didn't even acknowledge his request. Instead, he opened the back door of the patrol car and gestured for Marcus to get in. Marcus hesitated for a moment, still in disbelief over the whole situation. But he knew there was no point in arguing further. For now, it seemed like his only option was to cooperate. He sat in the back of the car, the cold metal of the handcuffs pressing into his wrists. The officer slammed the door shut, and Marcus was left alone in the back seat. His thoughts raced. He had never been in a situation like this before. He had always been on the other side, dealing with the law, not being the one to face it. What was going to happen next? Was this some kind of mistake? Or was something more troubling at play here? The car slowly began to move, taking him farther from the hotel. As it drove, Marcus couldn't help but feel that this was no ordinary traffic stop. The officer had acted with such certainty, as if Marcus had already been guilty of something. What kind of suspicion had led to this? And why wasn't he being given a fair chance to explain himself? As the car continued down the quiet street, Marcus's mind kept racing. He had to stay calm, but a feeling of unease settled in his chest. Something was terribly wrong. The drive to the police station felt like it took forever. The streets outside the car window passed by in a blur, but inside, Marcus's mind was clear, though filled with questions. His thoughts raced as he tried to understand what was happening. Why had he been arrested? He had done nothing wrong. He had followed every rule, and yet here he was, sitting in the back of a police car, handcuffed and confused. As the car moved through the city, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this was not just about him being in the wrong place at the wrong time. No, this felt more personal. The officer's actions seemed to go beyond the typical duty of a law enforcement official. It was almost as if he was being targeted. Marcus wasn't naive. He knew how some people were treated differently because of their race or status. He had heard the stories, seen the news reports, and understood the struggles many others faced. But Marcus had never imagined he would be on the receiving end of such treatment. The billionaire CEO, who had spent years working hard to build his company and contribute to the community, now found himself a victim of an injustice he never thought would happen to him. His wealth, his status, and his hard work meant nothing in this moment. The officer wasn't listening to his explanations or acknowledging his identity. In fact, the officer's response seemed dismissive, as though it didn't matter who Marcus was or what he had accomplished. As the car continued its journey, Marcus thought about his company, his family, and everything he had built. It was hard not to think that this could affect everything he had worked for. His name was known around the world, but in this moment, none of that mattered. He was just another person being treated unfairly. The sound of the radio crackled from the front of the car. The officer had been speaking to dispatch, but Marcus couldn't hear the conversation clearly. It wasn't long before the car pulled into the parking lot of the police station. The lights of the building flickered in the distance, and Marcus could feel his stomach tighten. This was the part he had been dreading. The unknown. The car came to a stop, and the officer turned to look at Marcus. "Stay here. I'll be right back," the officer said, as if Marcus had any other choice but to remain in the back seat. For a few moments, Marcus just sat there, staring at the station ahead. He tried to calm his mind, reminding himself to stay composed. He wasn't a criminal. He didn't deserve to be treated like this. The officer returned after what seemed like an eternity, his footsteps growing louder as he approached the car. He opened the door with a cold expression, not showing any sign of regret. Marcus could see the indifference in the officer's face, and it made the situation even harder to understand. Was this really just a mistake, or was there something else behind this arrest? Marcus was escorted out of the car and toward the station. Every step he took felt heavier than the last. He was still in disbelief, still trying to make sense of it all. As they entered the building, Marcus couldn't help but think that this was the beginning of something much bigger than just a simple misunderstanding. There was more at play here, and he had no idea how it was going to end. But whatever happened, he was determined to find the truth. As Marcus stepped into the police station, the bright fluorescent lights overhead seemed to magnify the confusion in his mind. His hands were still cuffed, and the clinking sound of the metal echoed as he was led through the building. The officer, still silent, walked beside him with a firm grip on his arm. The hallway seemed unusually quiet, but Marcus's thoughts were anything but peaceful. "Officer," Marcus began, his voice steady but urgent, "I'm not sure what's going on here. Can you please explain why I've been detained? I'm Marcus Bennett. I've done nothing wrong." The officer didn't look at him. He kept his eyes straight ahead, leading Marcus toward a small, unoccupied room at the back of the station. As they walked, Marcus's mind raced. He had always believed in the justice system. He had always trusted that things would be fair. But this was different. He had been treated like a criminal without cause, without any evidence or reason. Once inside the room, the officer motioned for Marcus to sit down at a metal table. There was nothing warm or welcoming about the room. It felt cold, clinical. The silence between them stretched on, and Marcus couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. He didn't know if he was being targeted or if it was just a mistake, but he needed answers. "Why am I here?" Marcus asked again, this time with more urgency. "I've done nothing wrong. You can check my records. I've never been in trouble with the law." The officer finally turned his head, his eyes locking onto Marcus. But there was no empathy in the officer's gaze, just a kind of blank indifference that only made Marcus feel more isolated. "You fit the description of a suspect," the officer said shortly. "That's all I can tell you for now." Marcus tried to understand, but it was hard to make sense of what the officer was saying. "A suspect," he repeated, more to himself than to the officer. "I've never even been involved in any kind of crime. You can check my background. Ask anyone. I'm not your suspect." There was a moment of silence before the officer spoke again. "I can't give you more information right now. You'll have to wait." The words stung, but Marcus didn't give up. He had been in business long enough to know how important it was to communicate clearly, even in difficult situations. He didn't want to escalate things. He just wanted to understand why he was being treated this way. "Look," Marcus said, leaning forward slightly. "I understand if there's a procedure you have to follow, but you have to understand something. I'm not just any person. I have a reputation, a company, and a lot of people who depend on me. This could ruin everything." The officer remained silent, but Marcus could tell that the words were starting to sink in. Maybe the officer didn't realize just how serious this situation was, but Marcus wasn't going to let it go unnoticed. His voice softened, though he still spoke with urgency. "I'm not asking for special treatment. I just want to make a phone call. You know I have the right to one, right?" For a moment, the officer hesitated. His hand hovered near his radio as if considering whether or not to grant the request. Marcus could see the officer's unease. It wasn't easy for anyone to be in the wrong, and the officer was starting to realize that he may have made a mistake. Still, the officer didn't respond. "I just want to clear this up," Marcus said, his tone firm yet polite. "I didn't do anything wrong." The officer's expression remained unreadable, but his grip on Marcus's situation seemed to loosen just a little. Something in the air had shifted, but it was hard to tell if it was just doubt or something more significant. The officer didn't say anything more but walked out of the room without another word. Marcus sat there, still in handcuffs, waiting. He couldn't help but feel both helpless and determined at the same time. He wasn't going to sit quietly and let this mistake define him. Something had to be done, and he was going to make sure it was. Minutes passed, but to Marcus, it felt like hours. He sat alone in the small room, his thoughts racing. Every possible explanation for what was happening ran through his mind, but none of them made sense. He was a well-known businessman with a spotless record. Why was he being treated like this? Why had an officer decided to arrest him without any clear reason? He looked down at his handcuffed wrists, feeling the cold metal against his skin. The silence in the room was deafening. He tried to keep his mind clear and calm, but frustration began to take over. It was hard not to think about everything he had built. The company, the relationships, the life he had worked so hard for, and how easily it could all be ruined by a single mistake. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door opened. The officer from earlier walked in, but this time, his expression was different. He looked uneasy, even nervous. Marcus raised an eyebrow, sensing that something had changed. "You're free to go," the officer said, his voice quieter than before. Marcus blinked, taken aback. "What?" he asked, trying to process the sudden shift in the situation. "What do you mean, free to go? You just arrested me. I don't understand." The officer hesitated before speaking again. "We've checked your records. There was a mistake. We had the wrong person." Marcus's mind raced. A mistake? How could this even happen? How could someone like him, with no history of trouble, end up in a situation like this because of something so simple as a mix-up? Still, the officer continued. "We received information about a suspect, and you fit the description. But it turns out the person we were looking for wasn't you. I'm sorry for the confusion." Marcus couldn't believe it. All of this, everything he had gone through in the last hour, had been based on a mistake. It was hard to wrap his head around. He had been detained, handcuffed, and treated like a criminal for nothing. But as the officer unlocked the handcuffs, Marcus felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of him was relieved, but another part of him was angry. This had never been his fault, and yet here he was, caught in a system that had failed him. "Is there an apology for all this?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but firm. "I understand mistakes happen, but this isn't just a simple misunderstanding. You've disrupted my entire evening, and I'd lost valuable time because of it." The officer opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the sound of another voice interrupted. A new figure appeared in the doorway. Another officer, one with a higher rank, wearing a serious expression. He stepped inside the room, looking between Marcus and the officer who had arrested him. "What's going on here?" the new officer asked, addressing the situation. His gaze flicked to Marcus, who was still sitting at the table, trying to process what had happened. The officer who had originally arrested Marcus stammered, explaining the situation again. He mentioned the mistaken identity and the fact that Marcus had been wrongly detained. The higher-ranking officer listened carefully, then turned his attention to Marcus. "I'm truly sorry for what you've been through. We are looking into the mistake, and it won't be repeated." Marcus took a deep breath. He wasn't sure if the apology was enough, but he could see the officer's sincerity. He wasn't about to let the situation go unnoticed, but at least there was some acknowledgement that he had been wronged. For the first time that evening, Marcus felt a slight sense of relief. He wasn't guilty of anything, but the events that had unfolded had shaken him to his core. The officer's words about looking into the mistake were comforting, but he knew that things like this didn't just happen in isolation. He stood up, his wrists free from the cuffs, and gave the officer a nod. "I appreciate you sorting this out, but I'm going to make sure this never happens again. Nobody should be treated like I was tonight." As Marcus walked toward the door, the officers remained silent. The air in the room had shifted, and for a moment, the officer who had arrested him seemed almost apologetic. Marcus knew he would need to take action, but for now, at least he was free to leave. But he couldn't forget what had happened. As he stepped out of the room and into the cool night air, Marcus's mind was still racing. The evening was far from over, but this experience had already left a mark on him. There was more to this than a simple misunderstanding. He was determined to find out what and who was behind it. As Marcus stepped out of the police station and into the night, he took a deep breath. The cool air hit his face, and he tried to clear his mind. He had just been through something no one should ever have to experience. His heart was still racing from the tension of the past few hours, but he was finally free. At least, that's what he hoped. But as he stood there, staring at his car in the distance, he couldn't shake the feeling that this incident wasn't just about a simple mix-up. It was more than that. Much more. He had felt something in the officer's tone, the way he had treated him from the very beginning. Something wasn't right. Why had he been picked out? Was it just a coincidence that he was targeted, or was there something else at play here? His mind kept going back to the moment when the officer had first approached him. There was no real reason for him to be stopped. The officer hadn't even tried to hear his side of the story. Marcus had given him his name, but the officer didn't care. He had been ready to arrest him without asking any questions. Why? His thoughts were interrupted as his phone buzzed in his pocket. Marcus pulled it out and saw that he had several missed calls. His lawyer's number flashed on the screen, and he quickly pressed the call button. "Marcus, where are you?" His lawyer's voice came through the phone. "We've been trying to reach you. What happened?" "I'm fine," Marcus replied, though his voice carried a hint of frustration. "But I need you to look into something for me. This wasn't just a random mistake. I think I was targeted on purpose." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then his lawyer spoke again. "Targeted? What do you mean?" "Something didn't feel right," Marcus said, pacing back and forth. "I've been arrested for no reason. The officer didn't even listen to me when I told him who I was. I've never been in trouble with the law before, and yet I was treated like a criminal." His lawyer was quiet for a moment, and then he spoke carefully. "Marcus, we'll get to the bottom of this. I'll have my team start investigating right away." Marcus didn't feel entirely comforted, but he appreciated the support. He had dealt with legal matters before, but this felt different. It wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about understanding why this had happened in the first place. As he hung up the phone, Marcus couldn't help but wonder if this was part of something larger. Could someone have used his name or his status to try to bring him down? Or was there something else going on? Something he wasn't seeing yet. He got into his car and started the engine, the low hum of the motor filling the silence. His mind kept racing with possibilities, but he knew he had to focus. Whatever had happened tonight, he couldn't let it go without finding out the truth. It wasn't just about his personal experience anymore. It was about justice. He drove through the city streets, his thoughts returning to the officer who had arrested him. What had made him act so quickly? Why hadn't the officer questioned him? Why had he been so determined to arrest Marcus without any real reason? Marcus felt the weight of those questions on his shoulders. This wasn't just a random mistake. This had to be a sign of something more. As the car sped down the road, he made a decision. He would not let this go. He would find out why he had been chosen, and when he did, he would make sure the truth came to light. He didn't know where this journey would take him, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to stop until he had the answers he needed. The next morning, Marcus's phone rang early. It was his lawyer, calling with an update. "Marcus, we found something. I think you should come to the office as soon as you can." He was confused. "What did you find?" he asked, his curiosity piqued. "It's about the officer who arrested you. There's more to this story than we thought," the lawyer replied. "You need to hear it in person." Marcus's heart raced. The situation had started with confusion, but now it seemed to be growing into something far more complicated. He quickly got dressed and headed to his lawyer's office, his mind spinning with questions. As he arrived, his lawyer greeted him with a serious expression. "Have a seat. I need to explain what we've uncovered." The lawyer handed him a file. "We've looked into the officer who arrested you. His name is Officer James Cooper. At first, we thought this was just a case of mistaken identity. But after digging deeper, we've discovered that Cooper has a history of making questionable decisions." Marcus flipped through the papers in the file, his eyes widening as he read. "He's done this before?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "Yes," the lawyer confirmed. "This isn't the first time Officer Cooper has been involved in incidents where people were wrongfully detained. And we've also learned that he has personal ties to a local group that has been under investigation for some time." Marcus sat back, stunned. It was becoming clear that his arrest had not been random, but he still couldn't understand why he had been targeted. "What does this mean for me?" he asked. "It means we need to be very careful," his lawyer replied. "This isn't just about clearing your name anymore. We may be dealing with something much larger." Meanwhile, back at the police station, Officer Cooper had been summoned to a meeting with his superiors. He entered the room, his face pale and his hands shaking. He knew he was in trouble. He had never thought things would go this far. "I've been asked to speak to you about your recent actions," Captain Reynolds said, looking at him sternly. "Do you realize the trouble you've caused? You arrested a well-known businessman without any real reason. You didn't follow protocol. And now we're dealing with the fallout." Officer Cooper swallowed hard. "Captain, I didn't mean for this to happen," he stammered. "Then what did you mean?" Captain Reynolds snapped. "Why did you arrest him in the first place? You couldn't even explain why. You've acted recklessly. And now you've put yourself and the department in a very difficult position." Cooper's heart raced. I thought he was someone else. I swear, I thought he was involved in something illegal. But when I realized my mistake, it was too late. I panicked." The captain glared at him, clearly frustrated. "You panicked? That's not good enough. You're supposed to be trained to handle situations like this, not jump to conclusions. Do you understand the consequences of what you've done?" "Yes, Captain," Cooper whispered, his voice trembling. "I know. I'm sorry." Captain Reynolds stood up, walking around the room. "Sorry doesn't fix this. You've made a mess of this situation, and now you need to take responsibility for it. If Marcus Bennett decides to press charges, your career could be over. And that's just the beginning. Do you want to keep your job, Cooper?" Cooper nodded quickly, his face pale. "Please, Captain, I never meant for this to happen. I'm begging you. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. Please don't let it ruin my career." The captain looked at him for a long moment, then sighed. "You're lucky Bennett hasn't made any formal complaints yet, but you need to get ahead of this. You need to go to him and apologize. It's the only way to begin making things right." Officer Cooper swallowed hard. "Yes, Captain, I will." As he left the captain's office, Officer Cooper felt the weight of his mistake bearing down on him. He was scared. He had always thought of himself as a man of principle, but now, all he wanted was to make things right. The thought of losing everything, his job, his reputation, was too much to bear. The only thing he could do now was beg for mercy. The sun had already begun to set by the time Marcus made his way back to his office. The events of the past day felt like a whirlwind. He had been wrongfully arrested, spent hours trying to make sense of it all. And now he was finally free. But it wasn't over. Not yet. Marcus had spent the entire day reviewing the information his lawyer had uncovered, And the more he learned, the more disturbed he became. Officer Cooper's history of poor decisions, his connections to shady groups, and the way Marcus had been singled out, it all pointed to something far bigger than a simple mistake. As he entered his office building, Marcus could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him. He had been wronged, and while he was relieved that he was no longer in handcuffs, the truth still lingered in the back of his mind. The thought that someone had intentionally targeted him was unsettling. Marcus wasn't just a businessman. He was a symbol of success, and it seemed that someone wanted to tear that down. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was a text message from his lawyer. "I've spoken with the police department. They've agreed to a formal apology. Cooper will also be placed on administrative leave pending further investigation. You're free to go forward with the complaint if you wish." Marcus read the message twice. It was a step in the right direction, but it didn't feel like enough. He knew he had to take action, not just for himself, but for the many others who might face the same kind of treatment. That evening, Marcus sat down at his desk, his mind clear and focused. He made a decision. He wouldn't just let this incident slide. He would make sure the truth came out, and he would hold the responsible parties accountable. But he didn't want to stop there. He wanted to create change, to make sure that no one else was unjustly targeted the way he had been. A few hours later, Marcus was standing in front of a group of reporters. The media had caught wind of the story, and a press conference had been scheduled to address the situation. As he stood at the podium, facing the cameras, he could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about shining a light on the system that had failed him. "I want to start by saying that I am relieved to be free, and I am grateful for those who supported me during this difficult time," Marcus began, his voice calm and steady. "But what happened to me should never happen to anyone. No one should ever be detained without cause, without an explanation, and without the respect they deserve." The room was silent as Marcus continued, his words carrying a sense of determination. "I have been informed that Officer Cooper is being placed on leave and that there will be an investigation. I am not here to tear anyone down, but I believe that accountability is essential for justice." He paused, looking at the reporters in front of him. "I've made the decision to pursue a formal complaint, not just for myself, but for anyone who might be wrongfully targeted in the future. This experience has opened my eyes to the deeper issues within our system, and it's time for change." The reporters began to murmur, taking notes and asking questions, but Marcus stood firm. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about making sure that no one else would have to endure what he had gone through. The moment felt important, like a turning point, not just in his life, but in the way people would think about the justice system moving forward. As Marcus walked away from the press conference, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. It wasn't over, but it was a start. He knew that it would take time for things to change, but he was willing to fight for what was right. He had faced an injustice, and now he was determined to make sure it didn't happen again. The world wasn't perfect, but Marcus believed in the power of standing up for what's right. And as he left the conference, he knew that this was just the beginning of a new journey, one where he would not only fight for himself, but for everyone who needed a voice. The following days were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and media attention. Marcus was no longer just the businessman who had been wrongfully arrested. He had become a symbol, a man who stood up for what was right and refused to let injustice go unchallenged. The public's response was overwhelming, with many people showing their support for his decision to take action. Despite the media buzz and the support he received, Marcus couldn't forget the feelings of confusion, frustration, and fear that had gripped him during those hours of uncertainty. He had always believed in the fairness of the system, but his experience had shattered that belief. The arrest had been a wake-up call, not just for him, but for many others who had suffered similar injustices. As the investigation into Officer Cooper continued, Marcus found himself reflecting on the deeper implications of what had happened. The arrest had been the result of a chain of events, a mistake that had been made, but one that could have had lasting consequences. What if he hadn't been able to prove who he was? What if he had been someone with fewer resources, someone who couldn't afford to fight back? The thought troubled him. It wasn't just about the officer's actions anymore. It was about the system that allowed this to happen. Marcus had spent years building his career and reputation, but in the face of an unjust system, those things didn't matter. No one should be treated the way he had been, regardless of their status or position. One morning, as Marcus sat in his office, reviewing the latest news on the case, he received a call from Officer Cooper. The officer's voice sounded different than it had before. It was no longer filled with authority or indifference, but instead, it was soft and filled with regret. "Mr. Bennett," Cooper began, "I just wanted to personally apologize for what happened. I know it won't change anything, but I want you to know that I regret my actions. I made a mistake, and I understand the consequences of what I've done." Marcus listened carefully. He could hear the fear in Cooper's voice, but he wasn't sure how to respond. This wasn't just about an apology. This was about the system, about making sure that things like this didn't happen again. "I appreciate your apology, officer," Marcus said calmly. "But this isn't just about one mistake. It's about a system that failed. It's about how people are treated based on their background, or the way they're perceived." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Cooper spoke again. "I understand, Mr. Bennett, and I'm going to make sure this never happens again. I'm willing to take responsibility for my actions. I'm ready to face the consequences." Marcus didn't know what would happen next. Would Officer Cooper lose his job? Would there be more changes in the police department? He didn't know, but he knew that things couldn't stay the way they were. The conversation ended, and Marcus sat back in his chair, deep in thought. The apology was a start, but it wasn't the end. He had always believed in the importance of accountability, but he had also come to realize that real change required more than just one person taking responsibility. It required a shift in how things were done. The system needed to change. A few weeks later, Marcus met with his lawyer again to discuss the next steps. The investigation into Officer Cooper was still ongoing, and there were talks of reforming some of the department's policies. Marcus was determined to be part of the solution, to help make sure that no one else would ever have to experience what he had. As he looked back on everything that had happened, Marcus felt a sense of resolve. He had faced an injustice, but in doing so, he had become part of something bigger. He had found his voice, and he wasn't going to stop until the system was better for everyone. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but Marcus was ready to walk it. For the first time in a long while, he felt truly hopeful. There was still work to be done, but he was committed to making sure that the truth was heard, and that change was possible.